Hot chocolate? Azure, Cosmos,
Entity framework, power tools,
Technology suite.
Countdown commencing. T-minus 2 minutes.
Jeremy Lickness.
Shiro Chant.
Grace Lanston.
Martha Vickers.
.NET data. T-minus 1 minute. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We are go for .NET Data Community Stand-Up.
Hello, welcome again. We're back with another .NET Data Entity Framework Community Stand-Up, and we've got something a little bit different today. For those of you who are not aware, Shai and I have been on the team for quite some time. You may have seen us before, but Yishi is new to the team at Microsoft. He's been on a couple of stand-ups before, but this time we're really throwing him in because he's going to talk to us all about the Firebird database. And even though he's new to the team, he's not new to EF and he's not new to Firebird. So I'm really hoping for some good info here on Firebird and everything to do with Firebird. Yishi?
Okay, let's get started.
Let's go. Yeah, I've got no state of the unicorn. Sorry, there's not enough interesting going on, so you've just got to fill more time. So we've got the question already. What is Firebird?
Yeah, that is actually a good question. But as you can probably guess, Firebird is relational database. The origins go all the way back to 1980s. But many people probably remember Interbase, which was distributed with all the different Borland tools, Delphi and Visual C++ Builder, and all these tools from Borland. And when the Interbase was open sourced in 2000, I think like 1 week or something like that, the source code was forked and Firebird was created. So although the current version of Firebird is 5.0, the history goes all the way back to, as I said, 1980s, because even before Interbase, Jim Starkey, the original developer, architect of Firebird and Interbase, and even before something that was called JRD, it was called Jim's Relational Database. So he actually created the original code. And if you go into GitHub and go and look into the sources of Firebird, you will still find files and other pieces that are named JRD or Alice, which was actually kind of abbreviation for all else. The code was kind of dumped into this folder, which was like all the other helpers and shared and common. So that's what Firebird is. And when we touched a little bit of the history, not only it was like forked 1 week after the interbase source code was released, a couple of months later, Borland at that time decided that it was not a good idea to have interbase open source. So they removed the source code, but as it goes, it was too late because Firebird was already having the source code and already working towards making the first release. So we can say that Firebird is kind of like a stable, mature code base because it goes a long way into the back. It's written in C and C++. The original code base was written in C, and the initial versions of Firebird mostly focused on, obviously, improvements, but also converting the old C code into C++ to get all the different benefits and
object-oriented programming.
Yeah. And another small tidbit of history is that maybe somebody remembers that in 2003, I guess Mozilla announced that they will rename the browser from something that was called Phoenix into Firebird. But at that time, the Firebird was already a trademark. So in, I think, 2004, a couple of months later, it was resolved, and the browser is now called Firefox and not Firebird,
So
because Firebird was already existing at the time.
Yeah.
So
that's
I
very
see
interesting.
couple of questions. Whether it's cross-platform, like Maui. Yes, Firebird is actually cross-platform. You can install it basically on all the three major OSs, Windows, Linux, and Mac. But there are also ports into, let's call it, different or weird environments. At some point, there was a port to HPUX and Solaris and basically different operating systems. And it usually goes when somebody requests the port, somebody goes through what needs to be done and everything. And if it's super easy, then it's just like changing some like low-level APIs, working with files and network. And after that, it's just done. Sometimes other companies that are interested in having it on their environment, they will contribute porting into a different environment. But the project by default publishes Windows, Linux, and Mac, and also Android binaries if you would like to use it on Android as well.
That brings up a question I had. Is Firebird like a database server, like a SQL Server, Postgres, and all those things, or is it more like an embedded thing, like SQLite? What are we talking about?
That's actually a good question. Firebird is both. I will show you how you can run it as a server. That's kind of the default deployment that most people are using. So you start the executable, it listens on some port. By default, it's port 3050. So you can check. Sometimes people reported, hey, I installed this application and it installed Firebird in the background. So 3050 is the default port. Obviously, you can change it. But you can also use it in something that's called embedded mode. That basically means you will add a bunch of DLLs to your application. And when your application starts, it loads these DLLs, and it behaves exactly the same as the server. The only difference is there is no network communication whatsoever.
So then you're like SQLite, basically.
Exactly. Probably the biggest benefit of this one compared to like different databases like SQLite or even SQL Server versus SQL Express is that the file is exactly the same. The features are exactly the same because it's the same code base and everything. So if you, for example, need to have like a local database for some prototyping or like demo version for your application, you can do it. And when the user later decides, hey, I want to have like full featured server somewhere in the network, so like multiple users can access the database and everything, you can just take the database file, put it on the server, and it's done. You don't need to do any database conversion, dumping data left and right. It's exactly the same features, exactly the same file format and everything.
So I don't want us to, because I think there's a lot of questions coming up, and a lot of the questions are kind of around the idea of, okay, well, when should I use Firebird as opposed to SQLite? When should I use it instead of Postgres and everything? But I think we could go into all that now, but I know you've got some stuff to show us as well. So maybe we should jump in and actually see some demos and stuff, and then we can always come back and discuss some more of the things that make Firebird unique after we've seen some of your code.
Sure.
I do just want to react to one thing that you just said, Yishi. This thing where a database supports both modes, so both the network server and the embedded, it's just going to be short. That I'm not aware of any other, by the way, database that does this. That's actually very cool, and I'm you know, sometimes. Sorry, go ahead. Am I missing one?
It depends what it actually does, because if it's running it in process, then no, there isn't another database that does that, right? But SQL Server Local DB, which was also supposed to be something that you could run this, you could read the same database file and use the same engine on, has that same experience. It's somewhat broken because it's a massive out of process thing that gets kicked off
exactly.
when you start up, and so it doesn't really, and that's why I'm kind of saying, well, it's
You're
so
right,
I'm imagining that but local DB is trying to get that same experience. It just doesn't succeed very well at it.
Of course, another limitation there is that you're bound to Windows only when you're in local DB, of course. So what I was kind of thinking is, like, a lot of times, like Yishi was saying, you're starting out and you're prototyping, and maybe you are doing an embedded, like a thing where an embedded thing makes sense, but you'd like to later maybe graduate to something with a more, you know, an actual central database server and so on. And the fact that you don't have to switch databases when doing that jump seems very appealing to me. Like that's a pretty nice feature of a database to have. Just wanted to
clarify the local DB versus SQLite in terms of Firebird embedded, it runs in process. So there is nothing like local DB that it's still local, but it runs outside the process. In Firebird, you have it inside the process. So for example, even if you have like two applications using the Firebird in the embedded mode, they are not seeing each other or interfering with each other whatsoever.
And that is definitely an advantage over the local DB thing, which I was hoping that you would say that Firebird did it that way. So,
so as you can probably guess, Firebird is free for commercial use, free for everything. So if you want to use it, you can just download it, install it, and use it. But instead of me installing it and running it as a server, there's also one nice small feature that I really like, because I'm writing the ADO.NET driver for Firebird, and sometimes I need to test on different versions or different configurations, because sometimes something behaves differently on version X and the X+1 behave differently. So you can also run it as a local application. You don't have to install it. You can just start it from the command line. So what I'm going to do,
nice.
And maybe I will make the font slightly bigger, so that everybody can see what I'm typing.
Probably even a bit more than that, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah,
as
that's
much
good.
As much as I might not like it, people are watching on their phones.
So if I look at this folder, let's put it in here. It's just a bunch of DLLs and executables and other stuff. That's like the default installation. You can download the installer or download just the zip file. I downloaded the zip file and extracted it. And there's also what's important for us, this firebird.exe. And I can run it from my command line with just -a. That will start it as an application. So I don't have to start like Windows service or something like that. It will just run it, and I can just start connecting into the database. By default, it creates an icon here in the tray area of your taskbar, so then you can close it and whatnot. So it's running completely locally. If I need to close it, start different version, change the config or something like that. It's a little bit easier than fiddling with either systemd if you are on the Linux, or Windows services if you are on the Windows and
Lost him.
I think we lost
Oh,
Yishi,
looks like we've lost Yishi. So, okay.
the main presenter.
He'll come back, I'm sure. Yes.
Should we
yes.
do a little dance, Arthur,
So let's,
while to entertain our guests?
Well, I was just gonna say, since just while we're waiting, that yes, there's an EF core provider for Firebird. There's actually a few, but a good one is one that Ishii wrote. He's back, so let's get back onto it. Okay.
yeah, the browser just with the StreamYard just crashed,
Oh dear.
Uh-oh.
and I'm
Okay.
not sure whether it will survive another session. It crashed with out of memory, so I don't know whether something is
Ooh.
happening. We will see. I will be checking on the memory consumption, and
It's
let's
when
see.
he started Firebird that it ran out of memory. I'm not sure.
That
What does
might be
that
it.
mean about the resource consumption of this database?
Actually, when we are talking about the resource consumption, we can check all the files in the default installation. And sorry, that's not the default installation. Let me remove the plugins because I added something. It's like 30 megabytes in there, and if you download the zip, you will see it's like, I don't know, 15 or something like that. So even if you need to like distribute it with the application in the embedded mode, it's pretty
lightweight.
Pretty lightweight if you're adding into your application. It's not like you're adding a couple of gigabytes of data. So my Firebird is running default like command line tool for managing the databases and connecting is called ISQL, but it's really a command line version, which is not something that that I like to use. I like to use it, but it's a lot of typing and you cannot do like easy copy pasting and everything like that. So I will just connect and create a default database so I can do some testing and everything. So I will do create database, which is the default, and I will say localhost, and let's call it ef demo.fdb. By the way, Firebird does not have like a master database or anything. Any file can be a database, so even the extension for the file does not really matter that much. It can be any extension. FDB is kind of the default, but you can use whatever you want, and some applications, especially in the embedded mode, are using different extensions to kind of like hide it or just not have the default one. Okay,
So where you have localhost in, what would Firebird do if you didn't do that? Or do you always have to specify a host?
Well, in this case, I need to specify the host because I want to connect over the network. I can have the local environment without going through like the TCP/IP. In fact, Firebird supports multiple protocols, even something that's called XNet. So that will be like local without the database server. But 99% of the time nowadays, you are connecting through like TCP/IP and accessing some server.
So the database name here is EFDemo, and it's been created on localhost server, effectively.
Yeah, correct. So I can go and start slightly nicer tool that I have prepared in here. It's called database.net. It's what I use. It's not only for, let me make it a little bit smaller, for Firebird. In fact, it supports a lot of different databases around, and I'm using it kind of for everything. And it's written in .NET. It's using ADO.NET for most of the work, so it's kind of nice that you can access like SQL Azure and Postgres and DB2 and everything. And full disclaimer, I was given I think it's like the professional license by the creator of this tool. But I paid for like standard license or something. And when he realized I'm the author of the ADO.NET driver for Firebird, he was like, yeah, let me upgrade your license for free to the professional one. So
We
let
should
me open a data.
include a link to this if we can. If you send it to me, I'll add it to the links in the docs.
Okay. So let me specify this one. By default, it already knows his DBA and the master key. And the character set, let's use UTF-8.
Yeah, is it possible to enlarge the font somehow? Because I'm getting a comment that it's very small. Or maybe zoom. I don't know if there's a zoom option in the tool in StreamYard even. I'm not good enough with that.
I'm trying to
I'm not
zoom with my
sure.
mouse, but it's not working.
I mean, you can change the resolution on your display. That's the only thing I can think of. Or the zoom on your display, but that's quite involved. Depends how long you're going to be in here, I guess.
Yeah. Let me check all the stuff in here. I can switch into console mode. That's fine. User interface. No.
Big.
Big. Yeah.
Make big.
Big. There should be something where I can change font, right? Options.
Yeah. Editor.
User interface.
User interface.
There it is.
Yay.
So let me make it like.
Yes.
25.
Ooh, that's a lot.
No, 16. That's the maximum. Better?
Okay, that's better. Yes, we can see the menus, but at least the sequel is good.
Yeah. So in Firebird, the architecture is pretty standard. You can have views and store procedures and referential integrity and incremental backups and other stuff. Basically, whatever you want from your main database, you can expect it from Firebird. There are obviously some small differences, but if you want to set up replication, you can do it. If you want to use, I don't know, XYZ, it's probably there. It's not as good as Postgres because, Postgres has everything, but it's like a full-featured database. What's important is that Firebird is not using a transaction log. It's using multi-version concurrency control or multi-generation architecture, including for the indices. So you don't need any extra files, and there is not much like heavy load on the I/O subsystem. You can just use it even with limited resources because the I/O is not heavily loaded, at least not the same way as with classical transaction log. When we are talking about the indices are using standard B3, B+3 environment. They use two-phase locking because they are transactionally consistent, but they are still having multiple versions. And for the optimizer, it's pretty easy to select even multiple indices if you are having query where it could use multiple indices, because for the intermediate results, it is using bitmaps. So if you have like and, or, and other different conditions in your where clause, it will just create these bitmaps and put them one on top of each other and just create and or to get the result.
Interesting.
So
I'm curious whether that's a different technique. I mean, Shai, do you know if Postgres does something like that, or is that
Postgres
something that kind of does that
Postgres
too?
does bitmap as well. That's one of its planner strategies.
Is that a fairly common thing, or is it just because I'm just curious? That's all. It's not important. But...
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I've seen the term before, like as a general kind of database implementation thing. I would be surprised if you don't find it in other databases as well. I definitely know it from. Like in Postgres, some depending on the type of query you do, if you explain it, you look at the plan, you're going to see bitmap as one of the strategies there.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, small difference between, for example, the SQL Server is that the indices in Firebird are having basically multiple versions, so they are not like 100% transactionally consistent for a given time. That means that. For example, even if the optimizer decides to use the index, it will go into a database pages and fetch the records because it needs to validate whether this record is visible for the given transaction or not.
That's interesting.
So
yeah.
there is,
Yes.
for example, SQL Server can completely execute the query only based on the index, especially
Right.
if you have included multiple columns. In Firebird, even if you would do that, it will even go and fetch database pages from the disk because it needs to validate is this record that's in the index visible for the current transaction or not. So it's maybe a drawback because you cannot have something that goes only through the index. It always goes through the database pages.
I know how many. I'm just wondering how many of our viewers are actually aware of the ability in other databases to include columns into an index. So when you create an index, you say obviously which columns you're going to be indexing over, but you also have the option to specify additional columns you're not indexing, but that are just going to be included in the index itself. Which means that if your query just needs those columns, then your index is enough to satisfy the query to execute the query, and you don't need to do additional IO. So that's another sort of database optimization technique that I think most people are not really aware of as you're planning for how you're going to be indexing your database and so on. So that's actually a very interesting thing. And EF-Core exposes that ability as well. So you can configure included columns in indexes via EF when you're creating indexes, just putting it out there.
Yeah, when we are talking about the indexes, also a small difference compared to other databases with Firebird is that Firebird is basically like self-maintaining. There is close to zero maintenance of the indexes or even need for the DBA. It's kind of in its blood that it tries to do a lot of stuff in the background or given the architecture that it's not needed. So for example, there is close to zero maintenance of the indices. Obviously, you can always like recreate the index to have the tree completely balanced. But even if you have database that's running, I don't know, 5 years, you can survive with not touching the database whatsoever. That's one reason why people use it in the embedded mode, because even if the application is running for, I don't know, months or years, the database does not need a lot of maintenance. And maybe something like backup restore is enough to what you are doing. So I have a small pieces that might be interesting because I could be talking about the architecture and what is supported and what is not supported for, I don't know, like long time. And that would be probably pretty boring. One thing that might be interesting, given that we are talking about databases, is not that you can create a store procedure, but store procedures in Firebird are in two different shapes. One is a normal store procedure that you will run, and the store procedure will do something like produce a result or delete something in some table, or basically like a procedure in a procedural way of thinking. But you can also have a procedure that returns a result set. So you can have like a for loop that goes through something, or while loop that goes through something and returns these results. So let me declare I int, for example, and while I greater than less than 10, for example, do something. Do begin and the procedure can have input parameters and output parameters, and if I do magic keyword suspend, it will return its result as part of the defined result set. So I will do returns, and let's call it ID. It will be integer, and I need to assign the ID equals I. That should be enough. Let's execute it. Hopefully it's fine. It is. Well, it's not fine because I forgot to increment the I and set it to some initial value. So I equals 0 and I equals I plus 1.
Databases are always missing for loops, like the simple for loops for some reason.
Yeah. but we will survive. That's fine. So now if I create a new query and do almost there, select star from test, which is my store procedure, we will get 10 numbers as the result set. So sometimes when I'm explaining this one,
so I was going to say that the suspend looks very much like yield in C#, right? That's essentially what's happening there, or am I missing it?
Exactly, that's exactly it. In fact, the store procedure will actually really suspend on this line, and until you like request from the network another result or another set of results, it will just stay there and do nothing. So that way you can stream even like unlimited amount of data, and the application can decide when it will stop. When the application stops fetching, the store procedure stops fetching. So sometimes when I'm explaining this one, I'm always telling people, hey, you can think about this one as a parameterized view, because it basically returns a result. You can do join, you can do filtering, you can do whatever, but you can also have an input parameters, input arguments, and that might tweak the result or fetch something from the database slightly differently. And basically you have like a view that's based on some parameter.
So what's the perf like of doing something like this?
What do you mean? Like calling a store procedure?
No, I guess what I mean is, like, and the answer may be it's fine, like it's just like anything else. But when you're actually dynamically creating the result set and using suspend between each time you put a result into it, are there any perf implications of doing that?
Well, yes and no. On the server side, there is like no perf disadvantages of doing it this way. It's just running the code and producing the results. On the other hand, if you are doing like joins or some filtering or group by, there is no indexes. You cannot have index on the store procedure. So if you go a little bit overboard and you start putting a lot of logic into this one, and then join with a table or something, it will be really heavy, because it will be basically doing like a natural scan of the result set, because you don't have indices or some other data structures that would make that a little bit faster.
I mean, the database could, in theory, decide if it's a... Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Shai. I'm guessing my audio is delayed or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we also see your video is a little bit, I think there might be some connectivity issues on your end. But anyway, what I wanted to say, I'm kind of familiar with this. I don't remember from where, like not specifically this, but suspend, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that something suspends, right? Like the database, when running this procedure, can decide to take like 100 rows, just do the loop, and then if it needs to suspend because, for example, the client hasn't read them yet and there's no buffering or whatever, then it could decide to suspend, but that doesn't mean that it has to suspend, right? This is just a way to code it to basically provide. In fact, I think maybe suspend you should be read as move to the next row rather than actually in any sort of. But that's I'm not talking about Firebird. I'm just kind of thinking about how this might work in a database. And I also to what you were saying, Yishi, I know that at least theoretically, in some cases, a database can decide, like this is all very declarative, and a database decides how to actually implement the queries and what to do. So there's nothing stopping a database, for example, from deciding to dump this into disk, make a temporary sort of index over it or whatever it wants in order to satisfy a faster, a query in a fast way if it decides that it makes sense. I have no idea whether a data, Firebird does that, of course.
Yeah, it is obviously possible. Firebird is not able to do it. I think the biggest reason is that you have no idea how big the result set is going to be. The store procedure can be running forever in case you can have while true loop. And as long as somebody is fetching, it's producing the result. But going back into the suspend keyword, it is actually suspending the execution. So if I would do select first one from the test, which would fetch only the first row, and then in here I would like throw an exception or do I equals I
was wondering
divided
about
by
that.
0 or something like that. It would not throw an exception. It would just be fine executing this one, because it would go through all this code and then go into suspend. And because my query only fetches the first record, it would just stop going into the next row and next row. And yeah, it would never throw an exception or anything like that. It's obviously driven. It's obviously driven, or it could be driven by the client application. So for example, the ADO.NET driver for Firebird that I'm writing is by default fetching 200 rows, because it would be too expensive to go one row at a time. So it always asks server like, hey, give me 200 rows to kind of fill all the buffers and all the packets instead of going like one by one. But you can definitely do just like fetch me one record, and then if you don't go to the next one, it will never go there.
So I mean, we're really just talking for fun now, but the same thing that you just said that your ADO.NET provider does could in theory be done internally. So the server could be also, you know, running this a lot. And yes, it sees an exception, but nobody has asked for that row yet. So it might know that this is already aborted, so that it has aborted, but without reporting it. So it would basically not be visible. I'm just saying, you know, in theory.
I mean, now we're getting into all of the
speculation
impacts of side effects, right? It's like
exactly
if you allow this, then you have to allow side effects to happen or disallow side effects, and both of those have consequences. So yeah.
That's why it's so great to not have side effects
theoretical,
in programming.
Yeah, it is functional programming.
Yeah, and exactly for this reason, Firebird server is not fetching in advance, because you can have on this line like delete from something, and if you fetch in advance, well, theoretically, again, you can like do it in nested transaction, then do rollback or something like that. But Firebird is basically not doing it, especially because it has also support for something that's called UDFs, user-defined functions. I will go back into this one in a moment. And you can have a function that basically deletes something from the disk or creates a file on the disk. And you don't want to have file created on disk if you haven't reached that point in the execution of the store procedure. So when we touch the user-defined functions, these were originally written in native code. So the only way to do it was basically to have like a Delphi or C++ or C code that was loaded into the Firebird process, and it was then executed as part of the Firebird process. And this is all nice and well. The original design had a little bit of flaw that if you created something really, really stupid in your code, and because it's a native code, it's pretty easy to do something stupid, like accessing something that you should not be accessing, you could actually take down the full server. And depending on your settings of your systemd or Windows services, it might not be restarted by default automatically, so it could take down the whole server. And to counteract this behavior, there's even different like editions of Firebird, different versions you can run. And one of those is called Classic Server, which basically creates a separate process for each connection. So in case you do something stupid in your UDF, it will only affect one connection, and the other connections are unaffected. It's obviously a little bit heavy because it's starting different processes. So all the caches and everything is not shared. But especially if you are worried about, first of all, using all of your different CPUs you have, it's a good idea, especially if you're like long running queries. And the stability is obviously the paramount, because as I said, if something happens, even in the Firebird code, that takes down the process, only one connection will be affected, and other users, other connections are running just fine.
In your experience using Firebird databases, is stored procedure, like native code, crashing the whole process a real concern for most people? I mean, I guess I'm basing this on a little bit the idea that you're probably only using stored procedures that you have tested and feel are reliable and everything, right?
Yes, but the way of how the data is passed, especially with blobs, is difficult. So you can create a procedure that looks okay on the first side, and then in some circumstances, you will access like wrong pointer or something like that, and it will take down the process in the worst possible way. But the UDFs, especially the native ones, are kind of, it's not a first choice for people, because you can do a lot with functions that are available in the like in the SQL embedded in the Firebird, and the store procedures are just containing the logic. Like
That makes sense.
unless you are sending an email from database server and you need a function that's doing the email sending, which is a bad idea anyway, you don't need those. In fact, I think in the last 10 years or something, I haven't seen any like stupid logic done in these UDFs.
Right.
So
right.
it should be probably fine.
Makes sense.
But speaking about the UDFs, and also now called UDRs. So UDF is a user-defined function, and UDR is user-defined routine, which is like a new edition of this one that has a little bit of safe checks around, so it's not taking down the full server. With Firebird 3, starting with Firebird 3, so 3, 4, and 5 being the latest version, is something that allows you to create basically implementation of procedures, triggers, and functions in any environment. And a couple of years ago, I kind of, for fun, created a plugin that allows you to write the procedures in .NET. So you have a .NET running inside the Firebird process, and you can write your procedures as part of .NET. And in .NET, given that unless you use unsafe code, there is a lot less that can go wrong. The only reason why it could go wrong is that I made a mistake in my little bit of C++ code that I had to create. So let's jump into this one.
So that just quick comment in that, because that ties us back to the SQLite stuff again, because you know when you're doing SQLite with Bryce's provider, you can write the stored procedures or the functions really in .NET code as well. So when you're using Firebird in the in-process mode, is that an efficient way, or is it still starting up another .NET process to run your code?
Well, if you are using the embedded one, it's using the same process. So you are kind of limited what you can do, because like if you are running like .NET 6, you cannot load .NET 8 assembly or something like that. The versions needs to align. But for the embedded version, given that there is no like network round trips or anything, if you need to have some logic, and unless you really need to have it on the database side, you can just, for example, fetch the data and process the data locally, because it's still in the application.
That's a good point.
On the server side, obviously, you can have a heavy processing on the server and filtering the data. So the plugin that I created is called FBNet External Engine. You can Google it, and there will be links in the show notes. There is a free version available that's basically limited only to one execution at any given time. Otherwise, it's completely functionally equivalent to the non-free one, let's call it, and it allows you to create these stored procedures and functions in the Firebird. So let me start the Visual Studio and create a new project, simple class library. Let's call it class library 1. That looks like a good name. And the class needs to be static. So I just have a static class called class 1, or maybe let's do my functions. That will be slightly easier. And then I will do public static, almost there, static, and let's return an integer. It always needs to be nullable, because you always can have a null values in the database. So I'm requiring that the parameters are always nullable. And let's call it increment. And obviously, it will have an incoming integer. So what I will do, I will just return value +1, which is probably not the best idea to handle it, because I should handle null values and everything one way or the other. I will just do +1, and that's about it. So now I can just build my library. And what will be the fastest way? Take the executable from the debug folder, just the DLL, standard .NET DLL. I will just copy paste it into the external engine.
Old school.
Old school,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Just copy paste the DLL.
DLL deployment, yes.
Exactly. And that's all I have to do. Obviously, I need to have this plugin and everything. And then what I just need to do is create a declaration for this function. So I have here a bunch of examples, so I don't have to actually create it manually. So I just copy paste this one, because that's what I have. I will only change the names. So in my case, it's class library1. That's the name of the DLL. And then it's the full name of the function that I want to call. So in my case, it's again.
So this is what's binding your code that you've written in .NET in C# to be something that the database, the Firebird database, knows how to actually execute.
Exactly,
correct?
That's correct. I'm basically creating like a local function in the database. I'm saying what is the input, what is the output, and then this magic clause called external name basically says, hey, there is something that I need to load, and I see that I copy pasted it wrong. There's another small piece that's missing. It's this one, and I'm telling, what is it? Which engine to use, because you can have implementation in Java, you can have implementation in C++, and obviously we have an implementation in .NET. And I see question in the chat about F#. The plugin actually does not care what language you are using. As long as it's .NET code, it's absolutely fine. You can compile it into the DLL, and that's it. So you can use F#, you can use VB.NET, you can use Iron Python, you can use C#. That's absolutely up to you. So if I execute this one,
for the win.
Sorry,
I just said bytecode for the win. You can use any language.
You can. If it's what you like, you can obviously do that. But I don't think it's the most efficient way of doing that, in my opinion, at least. So let me switch into the results and do, what was the name that I used? Increment integer. There it is. So select increment integer. Let's do like 10 from, and magic clause for Firebird, which is like table that always has only one row, is RDB $database. So we don't have like dual or just missing the from clause completely, which you can do in for example, SQL Server. We have this like magic table. It is a real table. You can select from it, and it contains some really basic information about the database itself. And it's always having only one row, one record. So everybody is using it for selecting if you just need like a one result or something like that. So if I run it,
Funny.
It will return 11, which is not super exciting.
Nice.
And probably I would say that incrementing an integer would be easier to do in normal function written in SQL. But if you have a lot of logic and or you have a lot of algorithms already written in the .NET, in C# or F# or whatever, then it's pretty easy to load those into the database and do some business logic inside the database or some decision inside the database. Obviously, you can even send an email from the database, but that's probably a bad idea anyway.
It's nice that it can be that seamless and easy, I have to say. That's really, really very cool that you can just like, I've rarely seen it that easy.
yeah, I've spent a lot of time on making sure that it's really super easy. There are no external dependencies or anything like that. And the performance is still pretty good. It's not as fast as, for example, the embedded store procedure written in SQL, but it's not super slow. For example, fetching from the store procedure is exactly the same speed as fetching from the .NET store procedure. For functions, it's roughly 1.5 times slower than a function in SQL, because there is a lot of data flowing through the native code of the Firebird and going all the way into the .NET and then going back. I have a couple of ideas how to improve the performance, but given that I'm doing it in my free time and whenever I feel like, and as you know, with performance, there's always a trade-off between readable code and maintainable code, and then crazy micro optimizations. I'm not too keen on doing it right now, right here, especially given that when I talk with people that are using this plugin, they're like, yeah, it's fine for us because we usually have like heavy logic in the C# anyway. So it's not like a lot of data is flowing back and forth.
Yeah.
It's just something goes into the procedure, then the procedure thinks for half a second or something, and then returns a result. So it's not like we are fetching thousands and thousands of records from the store procedure or from the function that's being written in C# or in .NET.
Good stuff.
So I see a new question whether the embedded support for apps, whether the embedded is supported for apps published with native AOT. And the answer is no, for a simple reason. At the moment, when I'm connecting, or when you are connecting using my ADO.NET driver to the embedded Firebird, I'm generating using reflection emit a little bit of code, actually a lot of code in the background to have all the P invokes and everything aligned the way it needs to be aligned. And at the moment, there is no support for like using a source generator or something like that would switch this from runtime to compile time. So no, you cannot use embedded and native AOT together at the moment.
So I don't know if you have more stuff to cover, but we can go back to some of the questions about, why would you choose Firebird? I mean, I know we've seen some of the details now, so we can maybe like tie it together. So we had one. Let's do the Postgres one first, which might be the most difficult. Like, why should I use Firebird instead of Postgres? I think the embedded thing here to me is the obvious take home here. You get a powerful embedded database that you can also run on a server with the same database file.
Yeah, that's probably right, because I remember maybe in like 2008 or something, we had a conference here in Czech Republic about Firebird, and about a week later there was a conference about Postgres, and we kind of decided to have like one session about Firebird on Postgres and one session about Postgres on the Firebird conference, and one discussion was about the embedded. And I believe at that time the statement for Postgres was like, yeah, we have a lot of functions, but there's one thing that we are never going to implement, and it's embedded version of the Postgres. Right. So that would be like clear win for the Firebird. Other than that, I would say both database engines are really, really capable. Obviously, Postgres has a lot of plugins, a lot of extensions, a lot of extra data types that you can have. So if you need one of those, then the choice is obvious. Other than that, I would say use whatever you know better. Because for me, especially with the databases, what really matters is when something goes wrong, like the database becomes corrupted or the server is crashing for some reason. And if you know how to troubleshoot stuff in Firebird, then use Firebird. If you know how to troubleshoot stuff in Postgres, then use Postgres. Other than that, on the basic features like SQL stuff, procedures, functions, replication, incremental backups, and all these stuff, all of those two engines are comparable. And then we can obviously argue about performance. The optimizer in Firebird is not as good as it could be, but again, it's something that's not being worked on every day, all day by hundreds of people like other databases, like commercial databases. So yeah, you will find queries that are running 10 times, 100 times faster in Postgres or even in other databases. And on Firebird, it's using like wrong indices, or it does not have the index of that type, like with the include or something like that. But other than that, it's basically the same, and choose whatever you feel is most suitable for your application.
So there was also the similar question on SQL Server, Azure SQL, and I imagine some of the same things apply there that we just talked about. But I think the writing the functions in modern .NET is a nice thing that that you can do on Firebird that you can't do on SQL. So I know SQL Server has the embedded .NET framework stuff, but seriously, if you're using that in this day and age, you really shouldn't be. So please stop. But yeah, so anything else to say on that?
Yeah, for a Microsoft SQL Server, I think there is one big difference that you will hit probably when you start using the Firebird. And it's that Microsoft SQL Server is really good at handling any type of SQL you will throw at it. I'm always saying, hey, Microsoft SQL Server has probably the best optimizer in the world. So you can create stupid, crazy, whatever SQL statements, and the SQL Server will be able to create a good execution plan out of your SQL that you've just wrote, or some tool generated.
If you like to write bad SQL Server is for you.
Well, that's one way to put it. The other one is that
yes.
if you are using some tool that is generating the SQL,
like an
entity framework, and if it sometimes generates, let's call it suboptimal SQL because it does not have all the different information about the database or whatever, SQL Server handles basically anything. With Firebird, you will very, very quickly find that there are limits of what the optimizer can and will do. So you need to be a little bit more careful if you are writing the query manually. That's usually a less of the problem, or if you're using some tool to generate the query for you.
Makes sense. And then I think we've already mentioned that Firebird can support the local embedded mode like SQLite. So in what would you say the comparison is for using SQLite versus Firebird here for this scenario?
I think the biggest difference is that with SQLite, you are limited to SQLite. If you decide in the future, hey, I need full-featured database server that's hosted somewhere on the network and thousands of users are accessing it, you need to switch into the different database engine. With Firebird, you will just install the Firebird, copy the database file, and that's about it.
Yeah, that's pretty compelling. Okay, so I just wanted to, I don't know if you've got, we can carry on, but I just wanted to also bring up this one comment about you talking about the reliability and everything. So here's somebody who's obviously been using it for a long time and without a lot of downtime. That definitely seems to be a recurring theme of people using Firebird, is they want to have a system with very little maintenance that will just keep running. So I think that's a good take-home message to have there.
Yeah, correct. I know personally from multiple occasions that there was like an installation of some kind of system that was using the Firebird, and it runs for years without doing anything, like some kind of maintenance, nothing. Hopefully they have some backups running every day, every month or something like that. But other than that, just make sure that the server is having power or it's on UPS, and that's all you need to have, because it will continue running nonstop without any maintenance whatsoever.
Okay.
I've got a question, an unrelated one. So you maintain both the ADO.NET provider for .NET for Firebird and also the EF provider that's built on top of that, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And even the EF6.
And even the EF6, yeah.
Even
Well,
EF6.
I really hope you don't spend too much time on that particular piece of code.
No, I think like last year or 2 years ago, I decided to close all the EF6 issues with like predefined response, like, hey, it's in maintenance mode. That's it.
Probably the same time I did it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I should do that for the Postgres one as well. Like it's there, the repo is there, and every now and then somebody posts a question, but I mean, it's all dead at this point anyway.
And when we are talking about this one, I'm no longer maintaining the DDX provider. Thanks to your statement on NPG SQL, because I was like, yeah, I'm done with DDX. Whenever I have like option to go away from that one, I will do that. So yeah, when Shai said, "Hey, I'm stopping it," I was like, "Yeah, me too."
So for those following in the audience, DDEX is the Visual Studio data extensibility thing. So that's basically the way you can write a Visual Studio extension that integrates, there's the Server Explorer, and then your database shows up there, and you can explore the tables and run queries. So basically, all the integration of a database into Visual Studio, that's called DDEX, and unfortunately, that's a very old technology and problematic in various ways. And by the way, I still have to do like a release now of the VSIX, so I haven't like completely abandoned it, but I pretty much have, just because it is very problematic. So, and I mean, I think it's the right decision. But I was actually kind of curious. So go ahead. Sorry, Arthur.
I was just going to say, though, that we have in the last 6 months been talking to people on Visual Studio and other places about how do we make Visual Studio tooling actually be more up to date and handle those. So it's not like I can say we're going to do that, or there's but we're talking with people at least to update that to something more modern.
Yep. So I'm just kind of curious. Like me, you you own like the entire stack, both the ADO and the EF. So that's like a full stack. Which is super cool. I do the same on the NPG SQL, of course, with other people. I'm not the only guy, but that's different, for example, from the way we work with SQL Server, right? Where we do the SQL Server EF core provider, but SQL Client is a completely different thing. It's a different team.
Or even MySQL.
Or even MySQL is also, there's like the open source MySQL stack. There's one guy, Bradley Granger, doing the ADO.NET provider, and then there's another guy, Lawrence, who's doing I forgot his last name at this point, who's doing the EF core provider, right? And there's something interesting, and it's very nice when you basically control both of them in case you need some sort of services from one to the other or whatever. What has your experience been like? I'm kind of interested in developing both.
For me, it's especially difficult for the ADO.NET driver because you are kind of in between 3 different stones, because Firebird is releasing new versions and new features, and people are asking like, hey, when you will support XYZ? And then you have the .NET world, like new .NET versions and changes like the DB data source and everything. And then you have the EF, which is again like new EF version, and it's like, hey, when you will support EF8 or something like that. So I like working on all of those. For the EF, I have to say the difference between EF6 and EF core is night and day. For EF6, there was a lot of bending over to make it work.
Oh yeah.
With EF core, there's always reasonable way to make it happen. Sometimes it's a little bit more code. It's like, hey, I need just to change this one line that's been generated for SQL, and you need to implement a bunch of services to make it work. But at least there is a way. For EF6, it was different. The ADO.NET, the provider started, I think, like 2003 or something like that. I remember when I started contributing before I became the main and now the only maintainer, basically the first thing I was doing was switching some internal code to using generics instead of array lists and everything. So it was definitely before .NET 2. So the code base is kind of old, and some areas would really use some refreshing. Although in last, I think 5 years or something, I did a lot of work to removing all those like bad pieces and even making breaking changes. And I just said, hey, it's for good. We need to do it. and that's it.
Mhm.
Now it's the time because now I have the time. So that's the reason
Yeah.
why it's the time. So now it's kind of fine, but obviously the protocol for Firebird, I don't know whether you have the same with the Postgres, is it dates 1984 or something like that. So sometimes there is a couple of bytes and they have a different meaning depending on what is the previous byte or what's the next byte, or even it's like an integer and the high part is something else and the low part is something else. So sometimes it's difficult, and you say, well, it would be so easy if it would be like a JSON or XML, like just deserialize the response. And that's it. And now I'm fiddling with bits and bytes and literally with bits, because, for example, if you are sending null values into the database, you are not sending a value, you are just saying a bit array where each bit says, hey, is it null or is it not null? And especially
we do bit twiddling inside DF core as well, though, even this day and age. The state manager does it. The state manager has bitmap flags for the states of things.
Yeah, but especially if you are dealing with like network stream and fetching from the memory, and it's in different order because the network has it in little endian and you are big endian, or the other way around. Then it's like weird. Sometimes.
I like that, actually. I miss working at that level with low level networking and all that. That's fun, but obviously it's a very different kind of programming when you're when you're really on the wire there. And by the way, Postgres, like the current Postgres protocol is version 3. So they've completely redone the protocol twice already, which is one reason why it's probably maybe a little more modern than what you're used to in Firebird. But it still is a completely binary protocol with you do a length prefix and everything is very much binary encoding, like I'm sure you know very well. And it's always interesting.
Yeah, the protocol in Firebird was a couple of times like improved, but the bottom layer, basically how you encode an integer or double or something like that, it's exactly the same. So still bits and bytes moving left and right.
So we have one last question here about concurrency. Anything to call out specifically that Firebird does differently concurrency-wise? I mean, other than we've already talked about that it doesn't use locks and it uses the multi-version, whatever it's called thing, which is all very cool. Go see our previous community stand-ups on concurrency for at least some level of where some of that makes a difference if you're really interested, but it gets pretty deep pretty fast.
Yeah, I think I can take it from like high level. You can connect to the database server using multiple connections. You can have multiple queries being run at the same time. Most of the time, they are not affecting each other because of the multi-version control, and it's using different threads, or in case of the classic, it's using different processes. So it just works. You can have multiple connections, multiple users, multiple databases being open at the same time. That's just working the same way as you would expect in normal standard databases. If you have a lot of connections, a lot of concurrent users, a lot of queries running, and especially if you have a hardware that has a lot of memory and a lot of CPU cores, there's a little bit of configuration to get most of the hardware itself. You need to learn a little bit about the classic and super classic and super server versions of the engine. You can switch the engine by configuration because it uses slightly different caching and sharing of logs and everything. But it only applies if you have, like, let's say, more than 64 cores on your CPU and you are heavily loading or you want to have all these 64 cores being heavily loaded on the multi-user environment. And again, if you have multiple gigabytes or even terabytes of memory, because Firebird is not even small on the disk, but it's kind of really cautious on using a lot of memory or using a lot of cores. So if you have like a beefy server and you want to really the hardware to scream, you need to do a little bit of configuration. But if you have a normal server, I don't know, couple tens of gigabytes of RAM, like 64 gigs of RAM or something, I don't know, 24 cores, there is not much you have to do. It will just use whatever is available. But once you go into like nice, expensive setup with the servers, then a little bit of configuration, but it should be pretty straightforward to figure out the configuration. There's a lot of articles and a lot of documentation. You just need to fiddle and benchmark to see how it behaves on your hardware.
Sounds good. Okay, so that's awesome. Learned a lot about Firebird, and I'm sure we have, as always, not decided what we're going to do next, but we'll come up with something. Or if we really can't, then we'll skip one. But hopefully, we'll be back in 2 weeks. So thanks, Yishi, for everything here, and see you both next time when we come back. So bye, everyone.
Bye.